Okay, great. I'll send you the closing ones in a second.
Yeah, no problem. No rush on that.
And yeah, so we'll go ahead and start in about a minute or two as last minute people come in. So I'm going to go ahead and mute myself, but if you need me, I'm here. Okay?
Okay, thank you.
All right, great, sure, bye.
Actually, I think most of the stragglers can come in while I'm doing my introduction, so we'll probably just get started right now since it's a little bit of a longer one.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Students for Liberty's e-leadership series. My name is Peter Niger, and I'm the Internal Operations Manager for SFL. We're honored today to again have Dr. Jim Lark deliver a talk tonight on the important issues in interpreting public policy data. But before we begin, though, I'd like to take a moment to introduce Students for Liberty and the e-leadership program in case you're not familiar with us. Students for Liberty is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that is run for students and by students dedicated for liberty. We were formed 2 years ago to serve a previously unfilled niche at our universities by connecting liberty-friendly students with other students, faculty, organizations, and resources to help them advance their ideas and applications of classical liberalism. The resources we offer are wide and varied, and they include free books for student groups, a speakers network, protest grants, handbooks on running a student organization, tabling kits, and of course our conferences, which are one of our most popular features. The e-leadership program itself is our way of giving you access to the ideas and mentorships in liberty year-round from wherever you are. We hold 4 webinars per month, 2 on the ideas of liberty, and 2 on mentorship and effective techniques in advocating liberty. All lectures take place Monday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time from your computer, and for a full list, please visit our website at studentsforliberty.org. Now I'm pleased to introduce our speaker for the evening. Dr. Lark is a professor in the School of Engineering and Applied Science at the University of Virginia and serves as an advisor to the Liberty Coalition at that university. Dr. Lark is a former national chairman of the Libertarian Party and is the recipient of the Samuel Adams Award, which is given to the most effective activists, as well as the Thomas Jefferson Award, which is the Libertarian Party's highest honor given for lifetime achievement, which he received in 2008. He is a member of the Board of Directors for the International Society of Individual Liberty and the Board of Directors for the Advocates of Self-Government. And he is also on our Board of Directors for Students for Liberty. Now, without further ado, I present to you Dr. James Lark.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Niger, for your very gracious introduction, and good evening to the attendees. Thank you for taking the time and trouble to attend this webinar. I hope you'll find it interesting. The title of the webinar is By the Numbers, Important Issues in Interpreting Public Policy Data. There's a certain degree of not reluctance, but a certain apprehension that I have in presenting this, because it's possible that many of you in attendance will already know this material, and I don't like to bore people, so I hope you'll find it interesting. It could be a little bit long depending on how much I ad-lib with some of these points, so I do hope to have plenty of time for questions, but we'll see as we proceed through. Let me switch over, make sure that I've got my screen here. There, blast. Well, how did that happen? Okay, let me go there. All right, that's better. An outline of my presentation, just a little bit of additional background about me. Mr. Niger was very gracious in his presentation. Just a little bit about me. Some general comments about improving the ability of liberty activists to promote the ideas of liberty. I always have this. It's become boilerplate for me. Then I'll proceed to the main topic of discussion, examples of issues of interpreting data with applications to public policy matters, and then finally we'll have questions and comments. Again, a little bit about me. I'm the utility infielder in the engineering school at UVA. I hang my shingle principally in systems and information engineering, but I also serve as a lecturer in both the Department of Applied Mathematics and the Department of Statistics at UVA. I was a visiting scholar, or visiting schmuck at the Center for Study of Public Choice when it was still at Virginia Tech. Now it's at George Mason. I was a visiting fellow at the Center for Research in Government Policy and Business at the University of Rochester many years ago. I have some experience with campus organizing. I founded the Liberty Coalition and its constituent groups at UVA. As Mr. Niger mentioned, I'm on the Board of Advisors for Students for Liberty. I have the honor of chairing the Board of Directors of the Advocates for Self-Government, and I'm on the Board of Directors for the International Society for Individual Liberty. I've been involved with the Libertarian Party for a while, and I'm pleased to say that many of the LP members seem to think that I'm an okay guy. I've won a couple of awards, which is very nice. A couple of general comments that I always include in both these webinars, regional conferences, and the like. There are two important aspects of improving the ability of liberty activists to, quote, sell the product, unquote, and that is we can improve the message and we can improve the messenger. The two key issues, I think, as we go out to try to explain and promote the ideas of liberty, we must observe the highest standards of intellectual integrity, and we must treat people with courtesy and respect. Now, I hope that you'll find these points to be remarkably obvious and that you already observe them, but unfortunately, I've found in my many years in the libertarian movement, frankly, there are many people in our movement who observe neither of these points, and so I always like to emphasize them. Again, I apologize if I'm engaging in impertinence by suggesting these to you because you already observe them, but I think it's important to note them on a regular basis. The purpose of the webinar is to identify some important issues that will involve interpretation of data in public policy matters, and among other things, we must be very careful when we're looking at data to understand what data are being gathered, how those data are being gathered, the various strengths and weaknesses of certain statistics that we might use to gather information from data, and we also have to pay a lot of attention to how questions and issues are framed. So, a very brief discussion of statistics terms. I don't have time to give you a proper lecture about statistics, so I'll just go over a couple of things that, again, you may already know, but I think it's useful to point these things out. There's a big difference between the terms parameter and statistics. In the term parameter is used to describe basically something that's a numerical property of some population in which we're interested. For example, if you want to find the average age of people in Charlottesville, Virginia, or you're looking at a batch of computer chips and you want to find the proportion that happen to be defective, those are numerical properties of the population. We call those parameters. In some cases, we can calculate a population parameter of interest precisely. In other words, if it's a small enough population, if we can gather the information easily, we may be able to calculate the parameter precisely. In other cases, it may not be possible or practical for us to calculate the parameter precisely. For example, let's say that in order to determine the proportion of defective chips, if determining whether a chip is defective or not involves destroying the chip, then it's probably not a good idea to try to calculate the population parameter precisely because we're going to have to destroy all of our computer chips. So in those cases, we need to find an acceptable way of estimating the proportion of defective chips. And in cases where it's not practical to calculate precisely the parameter, we need to have some sort of logically valid way of going about estimating the parameter values. And what we do is we try to get what we believe is a random sample of data, and we calculate something called a statistic. A statistic is basically, it's a fancy way of saying it's a function of a random sample of data. More technically, in mathematical terms, a statistic is something called a random variable. It's a function of random variables. A random sample is simply a set of random variables that happen to have certain properties. And let's say that for the sake of discussion, we're interested in, for some reason, knowing the average age of undergraduates at UVA. So I go out and take a sample. I find 5 UVA undergraduates chosen, hopefully at random. And let's say that the ages that I find are those displayed on the screen, 20, 19, 18, 23, and 21. The sample mean of those numbers, the statistic, the sample mean, we take the average of those numbers and we find it would be 20.2. Okay, the sample mean is a statistic. It's a function of a set of data. And the value, the number 20.2, is the value of that statistic for that particular set of data. You'll also hear in statistical terms, you'll hear the term estimator and estimate. An estimator is a statistic. It's a random variable. It's sort of like the cookbook that you use to calculate the value. The estimate is the specific value. So in this case, the estimator for ours, it would be the sample mean. The estimate would be that number 20.2. But we can use lots of statistics to estimate population means. One, for example, we can use the so-called median of them. And a median, basically, you could think of that as the point at which half the numbers are above and half the numbers are below. So what you would do with the median is you would array the data we have here from least to greatest, and you would find, in some sense, the midpoint. I'm not being terribly precise here because the precision would take a lot longer than we really have. In this case, the median of these data would happen to be 20. All right. There are a lot of public policy issues which involve interpreting the difference between population averages. In other words, we may be interested in the average values or so-called mean values with respect to two or more populations. But in interpreting such differences, we must take care that the populations are similar in important ways. And there are a lot of public policy questions that involve comparing the means or average values of multiple populations. In more formal mathematical terms, if the distributions of those populations are substantially different, if they differ in important ways, then comparing the populations, or more precisely, by drawing inferences about the populations by evaluating the difference of the population means, you might end up having a very misleading picture of what's going on. So let's take a specific example. It's been asserted on many occasions that the average salary for female employees is considerably less than the average salary for male employees. And in some cases, this difference is cited as evidence, or in some cases it's cited as proof that there is what I'll call invidious discrimination against women. In other words, there's discrimination that really doesn't bear any sort of reasonable or logical test. And as a matter of fact, on the Students for Liberty Facebook page this past Thursday, I encountered the following advertisement. You'll notice that there is a little advertisement, a little photograph of Batgirl, and the advertisement said, "Watch new Batgirl video. Check here to watch Batgirl fight ticking bombs for fair pay in Virginia, where college-educated women earn just 67 cents for every dollar men earn." And then there's a website URL where you can go and get more information about this. Okay, 67 cents for every dollar. All right, that's an interesting point. However, the populations of female and male workers, employees, may differ in important ways that have nothing to do with invidious discrimination. In other words, to the extent that there are differences, they may result from reasons that have something to do, for example, with the fact that men and women are different. So one has to be very careful when bandying around terms such as women make 67 cents, college-educated women make 67 cents on the dollar for males. These differences in means may not really be very revealing. And as a matter of fact, it's actually possible for women to be the beneficiaries of discrimination. They can actually be paid a premium and still have a lower average salary. And as an example of this, let's take a very simple stylized model. Let's consider 6 people: Alice, Betty, Kathy, Art, Bob, and Charlie. Let's assume Alice, Art, and Bob are engineers, Betty, Kathy, and Charlie are teachers. Let's also assume that male teachers receive $40,000 for their, we'll assume that's $40,000 a year. Female teachers are paid $50,000 a year. Let's assume that male engineers are paid $100,000 and female engineers are paid $125,000. So in other words, each profession actually pays a 25% salary premium to females. Females are actually being, in some sense, discriminated in favor of. All right? Well, if we then calculate the average salary for females, it's going to turn out to be $75,000. If we calculate the average salary for males, it's going to turn out to be $80,000. So even when you have a situation where females are actually being paid a wage premium, a non-trivial wage premium, their average salary is lower. So when we go back to this lovely picture of Batgirl and this interesting comment, we have to be a little bit careful to take this with a great big grain of salt, because even if it's true, even if this statistic's true, and it's not at all clear that it's actually true, I haven't actually run the data to see whether it's true or not, even if it is true, that does not mean that we actually have an example here of invidious discrimination. Whenever you look at distributions of professions where the populations are different, if you're going to draw inferences, you better be doggone careful about how you do it. Now, it should be noted, one might reasonably ask if indeed there are job distribution differences. In other words, if there are more men who are engineers than women and there are more women who are teachers than men, is this due to some sort of invidious discrimination? Very well may be, all right, but those sort of questions are perhaps a little different they're at least different questions to ask. Another example of this when we deal with issues of comparing populations, let's say that someone asserts that because the average health care costs in country A are significantly lower than I'm sorry, let me see here, that if country A are significantly lower than the average health care costs in country B, let me actually make a little change here. That should be country A has a better health care system than country B. All right, because the healthcare costs in country A are significantly lower. Is this a valid assertion? Well, not necessarily, because it turns out that you very well may have different distributions in terms of the populations of countries A and B. For example, let's say that if country A actually has, let's say country, I got these confused here, so let me just make the change here. If A actually has lower ones here, this is one of the little things about making changes at the last minute, it's quite possible that country, let's see here, have higher proportions, that's why country B to have higher healthcare costs than country A, and yet it very well may be that you're going to have, see, country A has higher healthcare costs, sorry, little trying to do this on the fly here. Basically, the idea is if you have a situation where the populations are different, healthcare costs in country A are significantly lower than average healthcare costs in country B. In terms of the average, country A has a better healthcare system. Well, you can't say if there are age differences. For example, let's say that in country B you have much older people. Older people tend to draw much more in terms of healthcare services. So if the distributions of the populations are different, it really doesn't, you're not really in a position to draw any sort of valid inferences by virtue of the fact that simply there's a difference in terms of the means or average values. You have to look very carefully at the relevant distributions. If our age distributions are different, if you have, for example, different distributions in terms of premature births. For example, premature births require a lot of healthcare services, a lot of healthcare dollars. It's possible that you could actually have a situation where one country has higher healthcare costs per procedure than the other country, and yet, just as in the case of the discrimination or proposed discrimination for sex, you could actually have a lower average cost for the country that actually has higher healthcare costs. So you just have to be very, very careful in terms of this. Another example, let's say that we want to figure out whether or not the University of Virginia's engineering school it's a better engineering school than Virginia Tech's engineering school. By the way, I'm a UVA PhD and a Virginia Tech undergraduate. So let's say that we want to determine the relative quality of the schools. We're going to use undergraduates, graduate starting salaries as a guide to quality. We'll use it as a proxy for quality. Well, let's say that the starting salaries for 5 UVA engineering school students chosen at random happen to be $100,000, $50,000, $50,000, $50,000, $50,000. In other words, you've got one really unusual outlier here. The starting salaries of the 5 Virginia Tech students chosen at random, the graduates chosen at random, is $80,000 across the board. Well, if you do an average salary calculation, the average salary for UVA engineering school graduates is going to be $240,000. The average salary for Virginia Tech engineering graduate students or graduates is $80,000. So even though most Virginia Tech graduates make a higher salary than the UVA graduates, the presence of this so-called outlier is going to skew the average significantly. By the way, if we look at the median as opposed to the average, we see that the median salary for UVA engineering school graduates is $40,000, whereas the median salary for Virginia Tech engineering grads is $80,000. So in some cases, the median may be a more appropriate value, and thus whenever we're looking at public policy questions where people are looking at different populations, heterogeneous populations, if they are trying to compare the means of those populations and draw valid inferences, those of us who are keen to, for no other reason, matters of intellectual integrity, we must say, look, are you actually comparing apples to apples or apples to oranges? What are the distributions that underlie these different populations? Because if you have distributions that differ with respect to significant characteristics, distribution of jobs in the case of wage discrimination, distribution with respect to age, for example, with respect to medical applications or healthcare costs, you have a cocked up salary in the case of UVA graduates versus Virginia Tech graduates. By the way, we had a situation like this at UVA. There was a systems engineering student many years ago who was a professional baseball pitcher for the St. Louis Cardinals, which his starting salary cocked up the average quite a bit. So you have to guard for issues of outliers. You have to look not only at the mean, but perhaps at the median. And so anyone who wants to analyze public policy issues carefully, you have to have some degree of knowledge about what's actually being compared here. The second issue that I want to discuss is what I call different strokes. And in calculating information based upon data from different populations, we have to take care that the same type of data are actually being used. And as an illustration of this, a few years ago, the Center for Disease Control, the CDC in the United States, asserted that the United States ranked 29th in terms of infant mortality. And indeed, we lagged behind Cuba, for example. Some commentators suggested that this difference is, or could be, due to the superiority of government-run healthcare systems in countries that supposedly have the lower infant mortality numbers. Okay, well, maybe that's true. However, if you look more carefully at the data, it turns out different countries evidently use different methods in calculating infant mortality rates. For example, in the United States, we use the definition that's employed by the World Health Organization. That is, all babies showing any signs of life, muscle activity, heartbeat, gasp for breath, whatever, should be counted as a live birth, whereas in other countries, different standards are used. Now, by the way, this is information that I fetched from other people, so I'm not a scholar in this area, so I'm simply reproducing what has been provided to me. I'm not a scholar in this area and can't vouch for it independently. According to what I have read, Switzerland, for example, doesn't count, or at least at the time I read it, didn't count the death of babies who were shorter than 30 centimeters when born. Such babies were not counted as live births. In Belgium and France, at the time the article was written, births at less than 26 weeks of pregnancy are registered as lifeless. So if you're using very different data, in a sense, to calculate infant mortality rates, it should not be surprising. In the United States, we basically calculate any baby that has any chance at all for life as a live birth, whereas in many other countries, those babies would be considered lifeless. And therefore, one has to be very careful in terms of interpreting the data or the conclusions that people are drawing from those data as to whether or not it actually means anything. So let's look at a related issue in terms of gathering data. And this is one of my favorites. Many years ago, when the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit was around, the double nickel, various highway departments around the country were caught in a situation. The federal government was putting pressure on them to show that they were enforcing the speed limits. In certain places, for example, Montana, if you were going, I think, anywhere under 300 miles an hour, they basically gave you a $5 ticket. So the federal government decided to bring a lot of pressure to say, in effect, we want to see signs that you're enforcing 55-mile-an-hour speed limits on your interstate highways. So how might you do this if you know that people in New Mexico were changing tires at 55 miles an hour? How are you going to show that you're in compliance with the federal mandate? And you don't want to lie, of course. You want to be scrupulously honest and fair. Well, by the way, if New Mexico were found to be insufficiently diligent, the state would not receive its highway construction funds. And, of course, this would cost the New Mexico government millions of dollars, something they did not want to lose. Well, depending on how you gather the traffic speed data, you might end up with very different views of how fast people are going in the great state of New Mexico. For example, let's say that you're gathering your speed data by putting your sensing devices on roads that are proceeding up steep mountains. They have lots and lots of mountains in northern New Mexico. Or let's say that you have a speed sensing device and you park it basically near a police car that happens to be sitting beside the road. Most people usually slow down when they go past police cars. You might gather your speed data during, say, a snowfall when people are going somewhat slower, or perhaps you do it in Albuquerque on crowded highways around rush hour. So without lying, without engaging in some sort of false representation of the data, the way the data are gathered may be useful or not very useful in terms of giving you a true picture. And so anyone who's a student of public policy issues has to invest some time and effort in terms of finding out how are these data actually gathered. Do these data actually represent what they're purported to represent? Do these data give a fair picture of what's actually taking place? All right. Another big issue is what we'll refer to as framing the question. And in some cases, support for a position of a public policy issue may depend crucially upon how the question is framed. And there's a term called framing bias. Many of you are probably familiar with this issue, to which we must be sensitive. And as an example, and by the way, I got this from Charles Murray, Professor Murray, or Dr. Murray, had this wonderful example in his book, In Pursuit of Happiness and Good Government. Let's say that we have two different ways of framing a question. And let's say it's a question about highway safety law. By the way, I love to drive. I like to drive fast. And so a lot of my interest in public policy issues involves questions of highway safety, driving on highways, and the like. Let's say that we ask the following question. Should we adopt a law that will save an estimated 7,466 lives per year, even though it may require drivers to spend roughly an additional 30% more time on the road? All right, now we can frame a question about adopting a law in this fashion. All right, let's say we frame it another way. Should we adopt a law that, over the lifetime of an individual, will reduce the estimated probability an individual will die in a traffic accident from 0.0005 to 0.004, even though it, referring to the law, may require drivers to spend roughly an additional 30% more time on the road? Two different ways of framing a question about the same law. It appears that people are more likely to support the law if the question about its adoption is framed in the first way, in other words, this way, than if it's framed in the second way, it is this way. All right? So, the law in question, as you might imagine, is the so-called double nickel speed limit. In other words, the reduction of speed limits on interstate highways from 70 miles per hour, or in some cases higher speeds, to 55 miles an hour, the dreaded double nickel that was in place when I was growing up. So the issue of how do we frame the question, it can have an extremely important impact on whether or not people support something or don't support something. It can have a tremendous impact on how people will answer survey questions. So whenever we hear some comment about a public policy issue where public support is deemed to be in favor or opposed to some matter of public policy, we have to be very careful to examine in what ways the question is framed, and if we were to frame the question in a different manner, would we obtain different answers, perhaps radically different answers. The fourth issue, and again, this is something many of you probably already know about, but it's something that we see frequently in terms of discussion about expenditures, costs, and benefits in matters of public policy, involves the notion of present value. There's a notion in economics, I consider it axiomatic, some people might consider it self-evidently true, that a dollar in hand today is worth more than a dollar in the future. In other words, the world might blow up. I might get shot. I might have a heart attack. So a dollar in my grubby little paw right now is worth more than a dollar in the future. Now, it may be a very small amount more, but a dollar in hand is worth more than a dollar in the future. And some people refer to this as pure time preference for money or pure time preference for asset. Dollar in hand today is worth more than dollar in hand at point in the future. All right? So let's take this as axiomatic. All right? Let's say that we're looking at a stream of revenues or costs, and we'll represent costs as negative revenues. So if x of 0, x1, x2, xn represents some stream of revenues where x0 is realized immediately, in other words, that's a payment or revenue received right now, and then we receive payments in years 1, 2, out to time horizon n. And if we use an annual interest rate R, which will compound annually, the so-called present value of the stream of revenues associated with that specific interest rate is that expression you see on the screen. In other words, I have engaged in what is referred to as discounting the stream of revenues to their present value. X1 over 1 plus R represents the revenue realized in year 1 discounted to the present. X2 over 1 plus R squared, that quantity 1 plus R squared. That represents the revenue in year 2 discounted to the present. So discounting using present value allows us to commensurate monies today with monies in the future. Okay? Again, I assume that this is largely well known to you. Just in case it isn't, I am going through this little peroration here. Okay, let's say that we look at a lottery. Let's say the winner will win $50,000 a year for 20 years. And let's assume the first payment is received 1 year from the date of winning the lottery. If you have a 5% annual interest rate, annual rate compounded annually, then what is the present value given that interest rate? Well, it would turn out to be a little over $623,000. Notice that if we were to take the sum of the undiscounted payments, in other words, we were to take all those 50,000 payments and just lump them together without any discounting, that would add up to $1 million. So the present value of the lottery in this case is considerably less than the sum of the lottery payments. Now, if we had a different interest rate, for example, if the interest rate were lower, then that number, the present value, would be closer to $1 million. If the discount rate were higher, then it would be further away from the $1 million. So again, the present value of the lottery is going to be considerably less than the sum of the lottery payments. And some of you may know, if we were to invest the funds of the present value at a 5% interest rate, in effect, we could view that so-called present value of the lottery as the minimum amount, all things being equal, ceteris paribus, that we would be willing to exchange now in exchange for a series of payments of $50,000 a year for 20 years. In other words, we could either get our $50,000 paid out over 20 years, or we could take the present value right now. It should be noted, many of you probably have already noticed this, that many government-sponsored lotteries, they will advertise grand prizes. In other words, win $1 billion, $100 million, whatever, in Powerball. They will simply aggregate the sum of the undiscounted payments rather than telling you what the sum of the present value is of those payments. Now, in fairness to people who run government lotteries, since the present value that you would discuss depends upon the choice of interest rates, it's not really unreasonable for them to advertise the grand prize in the manner they do. But really, for people who actually can count without having to use their fingers and toes, people should realize that what they're telling you in terms of the grand prize is actually not really what you're getting because of the time value of money, the present value calculation. Okay. Frequently, people will discuss benefits and costs of projects undertaken by government over some multi-year time horizon. For example, advocates who are advocating governmental subsidies for certain products may claim that the investment of X dollars today will yield Y dollars during the next several years, where Y is considerably larger than X. Okay, I've heard many advocates saying if we invest, say, $1 invested in the program Head Start will yield $6 over some time horizon. All right, maybe that's true, maybe it isn't. We'll leave aside the issue of how accurate the forecasts for the returns are. One can always ask appropriately whether advocates for some subsidy, some program, are actually comparing apples to oranges, because they may fail to calculate the present value of those returns that they claim will be realized. And even if the advocates are calculating the present value, what interest rate, or equivalently, what discount rate or discount factor are they using? If they're using a discount rate that is not accurate, they may be inadvertently or perhaps very vertently inflating the value that they claim to realize. So whenever people are bandying about numbers, in other words, if we invest this much money here on some governmental program and it will bring about these returns over the future, one should always endeavor to evaluate the numbers according to some present value calculation. In fact, usually you should evaluate the numbers over a stream of prospective interest rates. In other words, you should do what we call sensitivity analysis. You should determine what happens if we change the interest rates. How would that affect the present value? Okay. Now, this is a little tidbit that I'm tossing in for this. This is not, strictly speaking, an issue of public policy analysis, risk and reward, sort of the way the other topics are, data analysis. But I like to toss this in. I always toss this in with my students at the University of Virginia. I teach a lot of different engineering courses, and I always like to find a way of getting this example in. So this is going to be a little bit of audience participation here. I'm sure you all have seen that really popular TV game show, Risk. Okay, the Risk operates. Each contestant will push a button, and there will be a randomizing process. The outcome of that randomizing process will either see a green light or a red light flash. and the contestant will receive a prize that depends upon which light is flashing. If a green light flashes, and that will happen with probability P, you win $1 million. The contestant wins $1 million. If a red light flashes, oh merd, doggone it, horrible death, excruciating pain. And we'll assume that the probability P is strictly between 0 and 1. So in other words, you push a button, the contestant pushes a button, green light flashes, the contestant jumps up and down for joy because he or she's won $1 million. Red light flashes, oh doggone it, horrible death for the contestant. I'm sure you've seen this game show. It's very, very popular. Now, we also assume the contestant is allowed to determine the probability P that a green light will flash. But we insist that when the contestant sets the value for P, that value must be less than 1. In other words, the contestant cannot eliminate the possibility of horrible death. Okay, so you've seen the game, I'm sure, so you know how it's played. Would you play the game? And I don't know if you can give feedback to Mr. Niger, who is at the console, but it'd be interesting to know how many of you would play the game. I don't know if you can respond fast enough to him. How many of you would play the game? In my experience, when I asked this question to my students at the University of Virginia, most of the students would play the game. In other words, they would set P being very, very, very close to 1, and they'd play the game for $1 million. All right. Well, what if the game were changed so that instead of a reward of $1 million, the reward were $1? Now ask the question, how many students would play the game? Very, very few would play the game. Okay, and that doesn't strike me as unreasonable. Now, what's the big finish of this? I suggest that we play this game every day. I mean, how many of you crossed a street so that you could come over and set up your computer so that you could listen to Doc Lark's incredibly interesting, not to be missed, they really ought to make it into a movie, webinar presentation? How many of you did anything today that might have some residual risk of causing a problem? I suspect all of you did. I know I did. I drove to the university so that I could be in my office when I'm conducting this webinar. We all do things that are incredibly risky, and we do it for very small gains. We just don't frame the questions in quite this fashion. And I bring this up in the context of this webinar because I believe that many discussions of public policy involve, first of all, they involve incantations about probabilistic notions that in many cases are poorly justified. The dirty little secret, and by the way, I teach probability and statistics at both the undergraduate and graduate level at UV. I'm really more a mathematician than anything else. The dirty little secret of probabilistic analysis is that in many cases we have no way of really calculating probabilities. We can take a damn good guess at what they are, but we really can't calculate it. We estimate them. In many cases we give what we believe are conservative, in other words, underestimates or overestimates. We can put bounds on probabilities that make sense. But in many of the big public policy questions, for example, whether or not a nuclear power plant will have some catastrophic release of radiation over some specified time period, over some specified geographic area, we really don't know how to calculate those probabilities. And so I like to use this example as a way of getting people to think about matters involving risk and reward. And I hope you find this interesting. My students, I'm pleased to say, usually have. So with that, I have left, I hope, plenty of time for your questions, comments, arguments, whatever you might have. I appreciate very much your taking the time and trouble to participate in this webinar. If you like what I had to say and you'd like to pursue some of these topics at greater length, please don't hesitate to drop me an email. My email address is jwlark@virginia.edu. If you want to tell me that I'm a moron and that you're really upset that you wasted however much time you spent listening to me, you're welcome to send that to me too. I frankly would prefer the first message where you tell me what a great guy I am and how much you enjoyed the webinar and the like. But any questions, comments, arguments you have, you'd like to relay to me, please don't hesitate to do so. And with that, I'll now open it up to questions, comments, and arguments. If you will, please send them to Mr. Niger. I think you can type them in, and he will be gracious enough to read them to me, and I will endeavor to respond. So again, I hope you enjoyed it, and any questions and comments you might have at it.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Lark. Yes, if you have any questions, just use the little questions panel on your right-hand side, and I'll see those. Dr. Lark, you might be interested to know that not a single person said that they would take the risk for $1 million, and a lot of people said no, they wouldn't. So apparently we have a very risk-averse crowd today.
I must tell you, I'm very surprised at that. Maybe I didn't explain the question. Of course, when I explain this to my students at the university, I'm there, and of course I can, for comedic effect, I can write certain things on the board. So maybe I didn't explain it very well. But that's very interesting. In my engineering classes here, and I'm ranging from first years all the way up to graduate students. Typically, for $1 million, people are willing to say, "Yeah, I'll step up to the plate if I can make P very, very close to 1." Very, very, very few people say that they would play the game for $1. That is vanishingly small.
Well, some of us do. I mean, I jump out of planes for a living for fun. So.
Okay.
Okay, we did have one question so far from Alex Ransom. He wants to know what the best way to eliminate or limit outliers in calculating statistics without being seen as manipulating or skewing the data.
That's an excellent question. The short answer is I don't know. The longer, more nuanced answer is I don't know, but I have some ideas. The easiest way to get rid of outliers is just to get rid of them, is just to cast them out. That is usually looked askance by statisticians. Although there are times where if you can identify the outliers with good reasons why those outliers really are not representative and thus should be eliminated, that's fine. But you always have to, in my opinion, it's always appropriate to include, first of all, the fact that you have excised the outliers and to indicate why you've done so. I think that anytime you engage in some form of excising data from a data set, it is incumbent upon you first to indicate to anyone who is looking at your research or your evidence or your papers, it is incumbent upon you to identify, first of all, that data have been excised, and then to explain your reasons, and then let people decide whether or not they feel that your excisions were appropriate. The problem is, in many cases, that data are excised. I shouldn't say in many cases. That's not fair. I can't say with complete confidence that people are engaging in data excision or removal promiscuously. I can't say that. I've heard suggestions and rumors, and I do have vague memories of cases where people did that. There has been some controversy, of course, about data used in developing proxies for whether or not anthropogenerated global warming is a big problem. I don't know the data sufficiently well to make an argument. I just haven't had the time, frankly, to go in and go through massive piles of data to see whether or not I think that any data excision has been done appropriately. But I have heard about controversies vis-a-vis trying to use proxy data to determine whether or not anthropogenerated global warming is really a problem.
Okay, excellent. The next question comes from Robert Cohn. Do you have any insights into the use of regression analysis in policy debates?
Well, regression analysis is an appropriate tool. Most statistical tools are appropriate when they're used within the appropriate domain and when people show the appropriate degree of humility in using those tools. Regression analysis can be very useful to allow you to try to see whether or not, based upon some posited causal relationship between the independent and dependent variables or the predictor variables, then is there some sort of relationship? Can we draw useful information? And so I think that regression analysis is perfectly appropriate. The problem, of course, and this is something you'll learn in any good statistics course, is that there are all manner of assumptions that have to be true in order for your regression analysis to be useful. So I think it is very important for anybody who's using any sort of statistic tools. First of all, you have to understand what tools you're using. which means you have to know your statistics and your probability in many cases. Also, you have to understand what are the limitations of the use. You have to understand, for example, if you have values over which the regression analysis may be useful, you don't want to try to extrapolate beyond those values because you realize that the regression relationship may not hold. Also, it's quite possible in certain situations where you may engage in your regression analysis, you don't see any sort of linear relationship, but it turns out that there's not only a relationship, you may actually have complete dependability of variable y on variable x. It's just not a linear relationship. So I assume, by the way, the question dealt with linear regression, which is what many people use, at least as a first cut. There are much more sophisticated regression analysis techniques. With respect to linear regression, of course, you could have a completely deterministic relationship between two variables, and yet it will show up basically if you try to do regression analysis for a linear effect, you will find that you have basically a slope coefficient of 0. So regression analysis, as with most statistic tools, are perfectly appropriate when they are used as intended. But if you have people who don't know what the heck they're doing, and unfortunately there seem to be people who don't know what the heck they're doing, trying to draw valid inferences from regression analysis, you can end up with all sorts of results that actually don't bear much resemblance to reality.
Okay, the next question is from Harris Kinney. It says, Dr. Lark, as younger generations rely exclusively on cell phones versus landlines, when do you think it'll start to impact polling in a statistically significant way, if at all?
It already does. If you talk to anybody who is involved in gathering data about elections, for example. In other words, if you're trying to ascertain the population parameter of the proportion of a particular polity that's going to for candidate A as opposed to candidate B, you know that if you use telephones to gather those data, to gather those survey data, there is a tremendous age bias in terms of students, or not students, excuse me, of people who have only mobile phones vis-a-vis people who have landlines. There's also another very important bias that I think is pretty widely advertised now by people who do polling research, and that is the phenomenon that many people simply won't answer their phones. I frequently, for example, will screen my phone calls. So basically, it is very unlikely that any pollster will ever reach me at home because I'm simply not there. I'll screen my calls and I just won't pick up. This is a bias that has been discussed at considerable length by people who are professional pollsters. So to answer your question, it's already showing up. It's already showing. Let me also mention a very interesting bias that I came across, and that is if you're looking at the news dealing with those foreign country meaning not the United States. I suppose if you live in Brazil, Brazil's not a foreign country. For those of us living in the United States, if you look at news from other countries, there's a very interesting selection bias in terms of the data that goes into news analysis, and that is in many cases the reporters who are gathering the data do not speak the language, or they do not speak the language very well of the country. For example, when I was in Germany, I was in Germany for a while, came back and saw a news story about what was going on in Germany, and it struck me that this story was very biased. One big source of bias is that in many cases reporters may speak to people who speak English, which many people in a given country may not speak English. Those perhaps would be people who are older, perhaps less well educated. So you may have all sorts of fascinating biases being built into when you're trying to do a story about something in another country. So one has to be very careful about all of these biases. Now, anyone who is a person of intellectual integrity will try to identify potential biasing aspects. The unfortunate thing is, in some cases, you can't really be sure that you've identified all of those all of those possible biases.
All right, the next question comes, let me find where I put the next question, of Brett Colin. It says, Dr. Lark, it seems to me there's quite a bit of confusion regarding correlation and causality. Can you speak on this briefly?
Well, yes, and I think you know what the answer is. Correlation and causality are very different. It's possible for two things to be highly correlated and yet there be no causal relationship between the two things, or the causality may go precisely the opposite direction. In other words, you may posit that because the rooster has crowed and the sun comes up. The fact that the rooster crows, as far as I know, unless it's a really special rooster, the rooster crowing does not cause the sun to rise, but there tends to be a pretty substantial degree of correlation between the time the rooster crows and the time the sun comes up. So I think that these effects are very important. Again, any competent analyst of public policy affairs will specify that causality and correlation are very different beasts, and that people have to be very careful interpreting data when they run regression analysis, for example, and they see what appears to be a strong degree of linear correlation, that you cannot necessarily say this means that independent variable X is causing dependent variable Y, that there's a clear causal relationship. So, I think most people in public policy analysis will identify that. Occasionally, you'll see somebody making that mistake. It usually tends to be the amateurs or the polemicists who engage in it. Serious scholars, I can't recall a situation where someone who really is a serious analyst, someone who has intellectual integrity, or if nothing else, just a reputation, would make that mistake. But there are plenty of times where people do seem to, it's not so much they say that this clearly implies it, but they seem to be much more willing to entertain notions that there are causal relationships when the data simply don't support it.
Do you have any good tips about presenting data effectively to policymakers that may not understand statistics very well?
That is a very difficult thing to do. The best answer I can give is to keep it as simple as possible, and to provide, in other words, to try to make things as clear as possible. Also to understand, to put yourself in the situation of the person who is going to be observing or listening. Whenever you're preparing any sort of information to be conveyed to others, if you actually want them to understand it, it's a good idea to put yourself in their place and realize, okay, how much time are they going to have to listen? What is going to be their background? How much background information do I have to provide? So put yourself in the position of those to whom you're going to be presenting, and try to keep it as simple and straightforward as possible. And also recall the notion that one picture is worth 1,000 words. To the extent that you can come up with a very simple picture that illustrates the point, that's great. But some of you may know that data display is a very important topic of research interest. How do you display data in a way in which those data will, or the implications of those data will most readily be apparent? And that's something that a lot of people have devoted a great deal of time and effort to. Indeed, good data displays, taking data and analyzing them and then displaying those data so that you can tease out information from those data, that is something, if you're good at it, you can make a heck of a lot of money, because good data display is hard to accomplish. Or at least it is for me.
For those of us who may be in the position of designing surveys and are actually looking for an objective read on an issue, what are the best practices for writing stimuli to minimize the framing bias?
Again, by the way, allow me to compliment all of those who've asked questions. These are very good questions, and I appreciate your posing them. I think I'm not sure that I can relate the best practice. The thing that I try to do is that I actually will try out my questions. I will put myself in a position where I'm trying to look for biases or ways of interpreting the question in different ways. I try to look at alternative ways. In other words, I try to, if I have a particular bias, let's say I have a particular interest in the issue, I will put myself in the position of somebody who has precisely the opposite perspective, or opposite interest, or opposite rooting perspective, and then try to design the questions from that perspective. So I consciously try to design questions in a way that will that will reveal potential biases or the effects of potential framing issue problems. And it's hard work. It is very difficult in many cases to anticipate how someone will interpret a comment or question. And sometimes you can be a prisoner of your own perspective. Sometimes the very way in which you look at it, it may be very difficult for you to conceive of how someone else, perhaps someone who has less knowledge about a given subject, how they might perceive the question or what biases might be introduced. So it's a genuinely hard issue. The only advice I can give that might approximate a best practice is simply every time you come up with a question, try to come up with different ways of framing it. See if you can come up with different ways of framing it, and then identify what potential problems might arise from those frames that you've identified.
Okay, this next question refers back to an example you gave. I believe it was the UVA Virginia Tech example. It says you arrived at a median of $40,000, but in the example, shouldn't the median have been $50,000? So it may have been, I'm not sure. I don't know. I didn't look at the numbers myself.
It depends on the issue of sample data. There are if you use, for example, Navidi's textbook, they would say basically array the data from least to greatest, and then find, in a sense, the middle value. So you will actually a formal definition of median. There are actually different definitions. In some cases, for example, if you're using a continuously distributed random variable, the median is the 50% percentile. That's the value that basically says the distribution function equals 0.5 at this point. So different authors will use different terms for the median. I actually use the median definition straight out of a statistics textbook that I've used.
Okay, I think maybe in the example, maybe the numbers got switched up in the answer you gave.
Okay, that may be. With respect to, again, it may be the example. He may have been conflating perhaps the two examples that I gave. I may have to look at that again. Maybe I copied something down wrong with respect to my numbers. I actually did notice, as probably everyone else did, that I actually transposed A and B in one of my examples. So my apologies for that. I'll actually go back and look at the slides, and if I whip something out incorrectly, I apologize. I actually will go through, check to see if there are any typos in the slides. I will then correct the typos and make the slides available.
Okay, excellent. And the last question for the day should be an easy one, and it's from a grad student in engineering who wants to know if every undergraduate should have to take a course in statistics before they graduate.
I'm inclined to say yes. Interestingly enough, I'm trained as a mathematician. My PhD is in something called systems engineering. However, when I was an undergraduate, I was a physics major right up until the last quarter at Virginia Tech when I took my math degree. I did not have the first time I was involved with a statistics course is when I taught one. I did not have any courses in statistics when I was a student, and I now look back upon that and say that was a failing on my part. I would, if I were to get in the time machine and go back and redo my undergraduate education, I would have made time to take a good course in statistics. As it turned out, by the way, Virginia Tech's statistics department was first rate. And I didn't realize it at the time. I actually had a wealth of very talented statisticians. I don't know whether they were good teachers, but they were very talented statisticians of whom I could have availed myself. So I now wish I had taken. So yes, I think it's a darned good idea for engineering students, actually for any student at college, if the student hasn't taken a course in statistics, to take at least a decent basic course in statistics. It doesn't have to be extremely mathematical, although you really ought to have a little probability theory. You should at least understand what a distribution function is for a random variable. But yes, I think in the way of my long-winded answer, I think it's a pretty good idea for people to have a course in statistics.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Lark.
I wish I'd had one. It would have helped me.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Lark.
Well, thanks to
thank you all the participants. I'm sorry to the questions we couldn't get to. I'm sure Dr. Lark will gladly answer any of those via email if you send them to him.
Yeah, if you would like to send me an email, I will endeavor. I will note that I have a fair amount on my plate right now However, if you send me emails, I'll get around to answering them as quickly as I can. Thanks to all of you who took the time and trouble to participate. I hope that you found my song and dance to be interesting.
Okay, thank you. Our next webinar is going to be next Monday, November 22nd. Tyler Grimm's going to join us and talk about how to win friends and influence people when talking policy. To register, visit studentsforliberty.org. On a final note, you're soon going to receive a survey. Please take a couple of seconds to fill it out. It allows us to have a better idea of what we need to improve so that students continue to enjoy these webinars. Thank you again very much, and I'll see you all next week.